It's South Hills Church. Today I have Pastor Chris Kretzu, our Costa Mesa campus pastor, with us. Because of our volunteers, we get to put these amazing experiences together. They are using the gifts and talents that God has given them to serve the local church. And through their efforts of serving, life change is happening. And I just wanted him to share this story with you guys.
Yeah, well, we just turned 5 years old a couple months ago, and we had a family come out and visit our church for the first time, and they've been coming pretty regularly since. And over the last couple of weeks, we've had some huge events. And that family, who I would still consider a new family at our church, they jumped in and started serving and volunteering in really cool ways that are unique to the ways that they're skilled and what they're passionate about. And so it's incredible for me to see someone who is still kind of new helping create these events for other newer people. And we have a ton of volunteers at our campus, across all of the campuses, that do so much. And I love when they get to be able to use those things that they're uniquely gifted to do. So I'm super grateful for the way they jumped in that way.
If you're here today and this is your first Sunday, or if you've been attending our campuses for many months or many years, it is never too early or never too late to jump in and be a part of our volunteer teams. What our volunteers are doing is not just serving our local church, but it's impacting lives.
Before a few years ago, anybody that stood outside on a corner with a sign, they were called human directionals. I'm not that. I'm a sign spinner. What I do is nothing like what they do. It's my passion. I'm not just there to hold the sign. I'm there to put on a show. I'm there to entertain people. I once heard someone say, "Don't fight the fun." And I thought about it and I realized that there were a lot of aspects in my life where I just wasn't letting the fun in. And some people feel that. People honestly tell me that I've made their day by spinning signs in the city of Los Angeles. I'm improving the quality of life.
Well, good morning, South Hills. How are you guys doing? Yeah, good morning, everybody online. There's a whole crew of people hanging out online. Thank you guys for joining us. I saw Alina is hosting, so thank you for doing that. Man, after what seems like the longest season that has ever happened, I am officially done coaching 7-year-old baseball. This is how long this season went on. When we started, the Angels were good. And I can say that because I'm an Angels fan, but it has just been unending. But it was really funny. Yesterday we had closing ceremonies, and we were all hanging out, and everybody got trophies and that whole thing. And I just will never get used to being called coach. It's just a very funny thing every time a little kid calls me coach, because that's never something that I've been called. I've been called a lot of things in my life, and coach is not on that list. But there are different things for all of us that we've been called. And sometimes in those kind of initial stages, it can be really surprising, confusing. There can be emotions. I remember the first time that my kid said, "Daddy." That was an incredible moment. I remember getting used to my wife calling me her husband, which was a very weird thing to get used to. I remember when I became a pastor and then somebody called me Pastor Chris. And that still is a little bit of a weird thing for me to get used to, if I'm being honest. There's all of these titles that we have. There's these names we've been called, and they can be kind of uncomfortable or surprising. They can be life-giving. They can be thrilling. And there's all these different effects that we have. It's no surprise that what you do is oftentimes the second thing that people ask about us just right after, what is your name? We realize that what we do really has come to shape so much of our identity, of who we see ourselves as. The titles that we carry, it kind of informs who we are. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but you know, it's so often that people ask that question. What do you do? What's your name? What do you do? What's your name? What do you do? And there's all kinds of different responses, and some people are happy to talk about what they do, and then some people are like, it's kind of complicated, and it's just everything in between. It's a mixture of experiences. I remember I've told stories here before about sometimes I don't actually like telling people I'm a pastor because that way I get to cuss out as many people as I want. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. I don't like saying it all the time because it changes the way that people interact with me. They either get really excited or they get really standoffish. And I had a friend who was having this huge baby shower. It was like a joint couples baby shower. There was tons and tons of people there. And he had heard me tell that story the week before. And so he introduced me to everybody at this baby shower as his mechanic. And then I started getting car questions, which I'm a lot of things, but a mechanic is not one of them, you know. So they found out really quickly that that was not an accurate title. But there's this reality of these titles, and it kind of communicates who we are and what we do, and we're always worried, or not worried, but we're interested in asking these questions, and it begins way before adulthood. Children are constantly asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? A couple weeks ago, this came up with Arlo, my younger son. He asked me just kind of randomly, he's like, Dad, how'd you get to be a pastor? And I said, well, I went to school, and then I got an internship, and then I got a job at a church. And he's like, I want to be a pastor. No, I want to work at GameStop. And it was like just like that quick of like, actually, I think I found something better. GameStop is better. It was funny because my older son, when he was younger, when we had just moved to Costa Mesa, about a year or two later, I guess, is when Sidecar Donuts opened, and we were going way too often. And he loved getting the vanilla twist donuts at the time. That I don't even know if they sell those anymore. But one day on our way home, he was like, can you imagine being the guy that makes the vanilla twist donuts? That's what I want to be when I grow up. And you know what? That's better. That's better than GameStop. My older brother, when we were younger, he had a friend at school. It wasn't somebody I knew, but I just remember this story vividly. I remember where my entire family was sitting. He came home from school, and he told my parents, I don't remember what the kid's name was, but let's just say it was Johnny. He's like, Johnny, today when they asked what everybody wants to be when he grows up, he said he wants to be a tractor. And I grew up in North Carolina, so it makes a lot of sense. But it was just like, but there's all these things. We're always asking kids, what do you want to be? What do you want to be? And I think that there's great intentions around it, but we never really ask like who they want to be. That's never part of the question. What type of person do you want to be? How do you want to be? It's always what? What is it that you're going to do? And I don't think we're trying to pressure them into making a decision when they're 6 years old, but this kind of idea, this concept continues to grow with us. And I remember I was 17 years old and picking a major in college about what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And I picked radio communications, you guys, because I wanted to be a DJ. At that point, I was 17 years old. Why not? If we're just dreaming about what we could be one day, it's a huge job market for radio DJs. And so I figured I'm going to no, I'm just kidding. But there's these questions, and I wonder what happens when we grow up and we don't actually become the doctor or the explorer or the vanilla twist donut maker. What do we end up feeling about ourselves or about our jobs, our careers, our success, if we don't actually do that thing that we once were or maybe that we still are passionate about? It can be a really heavy thing to carry for a lot of people. Can you experience fulfillment at a thankless job or in a career that you're not passionate about? I'm sure all of you guys have been reading the reports from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. pause for jokes. But they did this research, and last year, 2021, 47.4 million people quit their jobs. For reference, there's about 330 million people in the U.S. So assuming every human in America was working, about 1 out of every 7 left their job last year. Now, some of them left because they moved, some of them left because they got promoted or other offers, there was good things, good reasons, and that's fine. But a lot of people left, a lot of people that I know, conversations that I've had with people left because their job in whatever way was no longer fulfilling or it wasn't worth what they were doing. There was some disconnect between who they were and what they were doing and the ways that played out. Essentially, there was this idea, this thought that another job could fulfill something in them that their current job wasn't. And I think that we oftentimes have this question. I think a lot of us hit these moments, and maybe there's just normal busy seasons in your career or in your work or in the way you spend your time, and there's moments where we all kind of daydream about leaving it all behind, and I get that. But it's important that we acknowledge that not all of our jobs all of the time will make us happy and excited. And so what do we do in those spaces? I think it might help if we look at this word vocation. Our series is called I Need a Vocation, and it's a little bit of a play on words, but this word vocation is something that a lot of us maybe have heard before. It's not a super common word, but it comes from the Latin word vocatio, and it has 2 different definitions. The first one is calling, and the other one is voice. And I think in a lot of ways that this is such a beautiful description of what it is that our vocation is. It's a calling, and also it's a way that our voice can be heard in the world. It's a way that we can have say or influence or agency in the world around us. Vocation is your calling in life, but it's not just for spiritual types of people. And I really want to make sure that that's very clear. Calling and vocation is not just for pastors and missionaries. Calling and vocation is for all of us. We all have a calling, we all have a voice, and regardless of what you do, whether you're a banker or an engineer or a stay-at-home parent or a musician or whatever, the list can go on and on. We all have a calling and we all have a voice. And it's important because it's actually not about a specific job at all. It's not about whether you are a banker or an artist. It's about who you are and who you were created to be. And I think this is a really common misunderstanding, and I just want to share a little bit today of some of my own journey as well, because I think it can be helpful to kind of give an example. But a calling, a vocation, is about who we are hardwired to be and what you and I individually and specifically can contribute to the world. What is our voice in the world? It's not something that you just choose, like radio communications. It's something that you discover and unearth over time. It's a process, and it's a slow process a lot of times. It can be very, very difficult or challenging. But I know some people that are in their 40s and 50s and 60s that are still discovering and unearthing that calling, that thing that they are passionate about, that makes them tick. And the big idea for today that I really want us to hold on to and be able to embrace is that you and I were created to be someone, not do something. And I made this slide, and I would like to just fix it a little bit. You and I were created to be someone first, not do something first. The most important thing about you isn't what you do. It's who you are. It's whose you are. That is the most defining aspect of each of us as individuals, whether you are 5 or 50, employed, unemployed, retired, wherever you're at across the board, the most important thing about you is who you are. You were created to be someone. Paul, the apostle who wrote so much of the New Testament, and he wrote so much of the New Testament because a lot of it was letters that were written and sent to communities around the world that were starting churches for the first time, these brand new gatherings of Christians. And Paul would write these letters because he had gone out and he had told people about the gospel of Jesus and done this incredible job sharing the good news and having people change the way that they live their life. And so he couldn't be there to preach every Sunday, so he would send these letters to help them. And one of the things that Paul said in a letter that was written to the Ephesians is, "For we are God's masterpiece. He has created us anew in Christ Jesus so we can do good things, the good things he planned for us long ago." For we are God's masterpiece. Stop. Like, God created you. There's another translation that articulates it, that that you are God's poem, that there is this beauty and intentionality of who you are. You were created as God's masterpiece. Last week we talked about this idea that you were created in the image of the Creator God. Who you are is so crucial. And from that place, we can do the good things that God planned for us. And I just want to articulate that the good things that God planned for you, it may be being like an architectural engineer. Maybe that is something that you are called to do. But one thing I know is that it also never has to be tied to an actual job title. It's not tied to an actual job title. You are God's masterpiece, and from that place, you're able to do the work that God created you to do. For years, I believed that I was called to be a pastor. I didn't always want to do it. I was probably about 21 years old when I first started having that feeling of terror that I might have to be a pastor. And I really pushed back against it and kind of was kicking and screaming the whole way through kind of like the process of coming to grips with it. But at the end of the day, I couldn't escape this idea that I was supposed to be a pastor. And so I told people, went to school, did an internship. I'm called to be a pastor. I'm called to be a pastor. That's my calling. That's what God has created me to do. Like, I can't escape it anymore. And for years and years, that was how I would articulate it. And I think it's important for me to let you guys know that I no longer feel like I am called to be a pastor. That I wouldn't articulate it that way anymore, because there was a time where I was no longer a pastor. And I had this weird existential crisis of, well, who am I then? If I'm not a pastor, then who am I? I don't know who I am. If that's not what I do, then what is it that I do? What was I created for? And I'm not the only one that's had that experience. You hear all the time, and maybe you've experienced what it's like to have kids grow up and leave your house, and then all of a sudden you no longer know who you are because for the last 18 years, you've just been a parent. You've been someone who makes sure that kids are taken care of and fed, and now there's like this gap of, well, who am I now? Or there's people that retire and they start to go a little bit crazy because they don't know who they are anymore because their identity was so wrapped into their job description of the way that they spent their time, whether they were paid for it, whether it was a volunteer, whether they were a parent, whatever it was. All the time we hear these types of stories, and I went through that same thing, and thankfully I had a mentor who was able to talk me through this. And it was a process. It wasn't just a quick decision. There was this unearthing. There was this discovery time of figuring out what my calling actually was. And it feels really weird to share some of this. Not that it's personal, but it's just like, it's not about me. But I want to give you guys like a little bit of a frame of reference for what I'm talking about today. What I have come to understand my calling is to help make the church a more authentic place. That's really what I believe that God has created me to do. I was created as God's masterpiece. I know. And I believe I was created to help make the church a more authentic place. And do you know what? I can do that regardless of where I get a paycheck from. I can do that regardless of what my title is. I can do that regardless of what country I live in, what state I live in, whether I am healthy or unhealthy, whether I have a lot of money or whether I have very little money, radio communications amounts of money. Wherever I am at in life, I can pursue this calling because it's not about a job title. It's not about my job description. It's not about a plaque on a desk or a name badge that I wear or what my child calls me. None of my kids have ever referred to me anything regarding these words. it's so important that we begin to understand that this idea of calling, it can be fulfilled and experienced in your job. I'm lucky enough to be able to have a part of that be a reality for me. But it is not only tied to your job or your title. The Apostle Paul was not always an apostle. In fact, when we first meet Paul in the scripture, again, this is the guy that I just talked about, you are God's masterpiece. This is the one who converted hearts and minds to follow the way of Jesus all around the world and wrote letters to new communities and churches, and he was not always an apostle. When we first meet Paul, it was in Acts chapter 8. He was actually leading the charge in persecuting and killing Christians. Did you guys know that? Paul was not always awesome. In Acts 8, this is really kind of like a dark, theatrical couple of verses here. It says that some devout men buried Stephen and mourned his passing with loud cries of grief because he had been stoned. But Saul, this young man who seemed to be supervising the whole violent event, was pleased by Stephen's death. That very day, the whole church in Jerusalem began experiencing severe persecution. And all of the followers of Jesus, except for the emissaries themselves, fled to the countryside of Judea and Samaria. Young Saul went on a rampage, hunting the church, house after house, dragging both men and women to prison. This is where we meet Paul. So I know a lot of people like to make jokes and probably deep down feel like that they may not be able to go to church because of their past. But as a side note, if Paul was able to be one of the greatest leaders of the church and one of the greatest reasons why you and I believe what we believe today, then I think anybody is able to make it through the doors of this industrial building on Baker Street in Costa Mesa. Paul was formerly known as Saul, and he had a career where he was persecuting and killing Christians. And then he had a miraculous experience with God one day and receives what could be understood as his calling. And we would all like a calling like this because it does actually involve like a very bright light. And we would all like that type of clarity. But in Acts chapter 9, it says, as he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? Saul asked. I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. He replied, now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. And the story goes on. There's more details. And Saul, his name changes drastically to Paul. It's like this beautiful, powerful, crazy, unexpected. Can you imagine the fear of the first Jesus follower? They were like, oh, Paul, and now you're with us? Sure. I can only begin to imagine the chaos of this moment, but this is the moment where Paul receives a calling of what he is supposed to do, ultimately, to take the message of Jesus all around the world, outside of Israel. He travels far and wide, spreads the good news of Jesus, and even experiences his own persecution and torment all along the way. But what a lot of people don't actually know, maybe you knew that he was not a great guy in the beginning, but what a lot of people don't know is that Paul actually also had a job, a side hustle. He wasn't just a missionary and a preacher. In Acts chapter 18, again, Acts is full of the stories of the first church. It's recounting the way that it all played out. It says this in Acts chapter 18, and because he was a what? Tent maker, as they were, there's a couple he was staying with, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath, he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. Now, let me just break this down a little bit. What this is saying is, Monday through Friday, he had a job. And then on the weekend, he would go pursue his calling. He would work, he would teach, He would spread the gospel. He would share the good news. He would work at his side hustle. He would work alongside other people. There's actually other places where he said, we worked not because we had to, but because I wanted to give you a good example of what you should do. Don't give up your job. Keep working at your jobs and follow the way of Jesus. Keep working at your jobs and help other people experience this good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And Paul modeled and exemplified that. He actually had this job, and then on the Sabbath, on the day that was appropriate, he would go out and he would teach this good news. Paul worked, just like some of you work. And then Paul had a side hustle. Paul had this thing that he was passionate about, this calling that he had, that he had gotten from a bright light from heaven. He heard the audible voice of God telling him what to do, and he still was able to find this balance of what does it look like for me to work and to earn a living, and also to be able to pursue this calling that I have. Maybe some of you guys can relate a little bit to this. Maybe some of you guys work at a job that you are not necessarily ultra passionate about, but you have this sense that this job actually allows me to do things that I am passionate about. This job actually gives me the ability to do other things and to pursue other hobbies and other interests. There's one writer named Bob Goff, and he's a writer and a speaker and just kind of like this crazy, eccentric older guy. And he's always ready to have a party, and he loves like these incredible like joy parties, and he brings balloons everywhere he goes. And he's just like the silliest, funniest, smiliest guy that I think I've ever talked to. And he's a lawyer, which is bizarre. And anytime he talks about his job, he literally calls it, oh yeah, I fundraise Monday through Friday at my job, and then I do what I want to do on the weekends, the stuff I'm passionate about. And he literally has this mentality, and I don't know if it's right or if it's wrong, but it's just such a funny way of thinking about it. It's like, yeah, this is my fundraising for the stuff that I'm passionate about. And some of us work in jobs that are difficult or hard or that aren't fulfilling. A lot of people over the last couple of years, your jobs have changed. You used to love it. In the middle of COVID, in the middle of being a televangelist in an online church, I was like, this isn't what I signed up for. My hair is not big enough for this. I don't have my southern accent anymore. A lot of us, our jobs have changed. Our careers have changed. Things have shifted from what they used to be, or maybe just it's not what you thought it was going to be like. And there's this thing that you need to know, that it's okay to continue working in that job, because that job does not have to be the thing that gives you fulfillment. That job, that title, that plaque on your desk, and it's not need to be the thing, and it should not be the thing that gives you your identity. You were created to be someone first, and out of that space, you were created with a calling or a voice, and that doesn't necessarily have to be the thing that gives you a paycheck. I think some of the healthiest people in the world have a job, and then they also have things they're passionate about, and they spend their time on, other things they invest in. It's so important to have both of those things. And the majority of the people that I know that get to do the thing that they love, that they are passionate about, they have to have a side hustle to help pay the bills. They have to work on the side, work a little bit extra, because the thing that they are passionate about may not make ends meet the way that it needs to be met. It's important for us to recognize this. If we're leaving our jobs like 40 million Americans did last year, expecting to find some sense of fulfillment at another job, you're just going to keep hopping around, because none of them will be able to give you what you need or what you want the most. It only comes from recognizing who you are, who you were created to be, not what job you have. So if your job or if your calling doesn't have to be tied to a job, then we've kind of kicked the doors open to all different types of possibilities. And I know some of you may be like at a place where it's like, I really wanted you to tell me that I should leave my job and find something I'm passionate about. And I think I'm jumping ahead here, but it just feels like a better time to say it. There's actually another letter that Paul wrote in 1 Timothy where he said, if you don't pay your bills and provide for your family, you're worse than an unbeliever. Like, there's a baseline level of taking care of your human responsibilities. So yes, pursue a passion. Yes, get excited, dream big, but also there is no like loophole for getting out of your responsibilities for who you are as an individual, as a spouse, as a parent, as a friend, as part of a family. It's an important thing to remember. But all kinds of possibilities when we begin to open up, when we recognize that we don't have to solely find our fulfillment, our wholeness, our purpose in the job that we have, the work that we do. We're able to experience fulfillment by living out our calling, our voice, and contributing to the world around us, just like that sign flipper. I love the way that he closed that moment. It's like, I'm making the city of Los Angeles a better place by flipping signs. And he is. I get frustrated every time I see somebody just holding a sign. It's like, you could do so much better. So what do we do? What do we do when we feel discouraged or unfulfilled by our work? There's two things I want to talk through just as we begin to land this plane, so to speak. Two things when we feel discouraged or unfulfilled by our work. The first thing is that how you view what you do matters. How you view what you do absolutely matters. There's a story about President John F. Kennedy visiting NASA Space Center in 1962. I heard this story a couple years ago, and I couldn't remember where, so I spent the last week trying to dig this story up because it just fits so perfectly. During the visit, he noticed a man who was carrying a broom, and pausing from his tour, he did the presidential thing, and he approaches the man and he says, "Hi, I'm Jack Kennedy. What are you doing?" And the man with the broom responded, "Well, Mr. President, I'm helping put a man on the moon." And there's just like this hilarious, beautiful, challenging, thrilling piece about that response. This janitor recognized that he was a part of putting a man on the moon. He was playing a part of this massive, wonderful, thrilling thing. And it would not be overstating it to say that without the janitorial staff, that probably would have never happened. The part that they play in that center, in those offices, in that research facility, I didn't tour it in 1962, so I can't tell you specifically. But the part that he played, the way he recognized what he was contributing to was crucial. How you view what you do absolutely matters. He wasn't just pushing a broom. I saw this thing online a couple weeks ago. It said, how would you write, "I changed a light bulb" on your resume? And all these different people responded. And the funniest response was, "I single-handedly managed the successful upgrade and deployment of a new environmental illumination system with zero cost overruns and zero safety incidents." And some of you guys have filled out job applications before, and you have done similar creative writing. My first job at a church, I was a janitor, and this was back in the day when everybody still made business cards, and so they're like, "Okay, Chris, you can get your business cards made." And I was still in school, but I was the head of, I was the janitor. I cleaned the bathrooms and the classrooms, and I set up chairs and all the stuff. But my business card said that I was the director of custodial engineering, which I don't even know if any of that makes sense together, but that's what I did. How you view what you do matters. There's like this bigger reality, this bigger perspective. Zoom out. Zoom out of what it is that you're doing. Because if you're just totally focused on the fact of I'm sweeping, or I'm just changing diapers, or I'm just a cog in the wheel of this banking machine, or whatever the thing is, zoom out and recognize what you get to be a part of. And it might take a little bit of work. It might take some effort, some intentionality to do that. Delivery drivers can think, I just deliver things. But there's goodness in delivering things that meet basic human needs. Not all the stuff that I order off of Amazon specifically, but they're providing people with important things. People who make dog food could just say, well, I just make dog food. I just work in a factory that makes dog food. But if you begin to zoom out, and you can use your creative imagination in this process, it's likely that you're helping keep a dog alive and healthy that is someone's most important companion in life. Begin to zoom out and recognize it's not just this thing or this box or this Excel sheet or this meeting or whatever it is. Zoom out and recognize that you are part of something bigger and figure out how is what I'm doing helping create and pour into human flourishing. And, as I said a moment ago, at your very foundational level, your job, your work is allowing you to provide for your needs, which is something that each of us are responsible for. I'm going to invite one of my favorite people up to the stage, Sam Malstad. Come on up, Sam. Most people think that Sam and I are brothers, and I wish that we were. But I asked Sam to come up and talk a little bit because this idea of how you view what you do matters. You can come on this side, Sam. That way people on the internet can see you. Welcome to televangelism. Sam, I met Sam, I don't know, 12, 13 years ago, something like that. And when we met, I think you had just started a new job. But talk a little bit, share a bit about what you went to school for, what your passion was.
Yeah, so when we met, I was transitioning out of church work into working in the belly of the beast in corporate America. So I went to school.
Just kidding. You're not going to say what corporate? No, just kidding.
I went to school to be a writer, actually. I went to the University of Iowa, partly because it was the easiest one to apply to, and I was for sure going to get in, but also because they had this incredible writing program. I went to be a writer. I wanted to write for magazines. As a kid growing up in Iowa, I was a longtime subscriber to Surfer magazine.
It's your only window out of the farmhouse.
Yeah, it was like, show me water. Anyway, so I went to be a writer and then had this experience in college, and I went into ministry after accidentally studying. I got an accidental minor in religious studies.
Like you do. You guys
as you do. Then I went and worked for a church and also began as a janitor at a church. That's fun.
Custodial engineer.
Yeah, director.
Yes. Well, I don't know what your was.
No, I wasn't the director. But I did that for a while and then worked in churches for a few years, helped start a new church in North Carolina. We have a bizarre crossing of paths. Anyway. Did that, and then we were there for a year, moved back home, which was Des Moines, Iowa at the time. And it was one of those moments of I didn't want to go back to work at the church that I was when we moved. And I didn't know what to do, but I knew I needed a job because Amanda, my wife, was pregnant with our first kid. So I was like, well, someone has to pay bills that are inevitably going to follow this child around, right? So Amanda's dad had a friend who worked at a Fortune 50 financial services company, Wells Fargo. I worked at Wells Fargo. And I got a job. I had a recruiter call me. They had two jobs. One paid more than the other. So it's that one. And did that. And very soon after had an existential crisis.
Yeah.
I'm like, what in the world have I done?
Because that probably checked every box of what you were passionate about in life.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, so from writing to ministry to now working, I've seen that building.
Yep.
It's like the Death Star in
is.
real life. It's
Yeah.
freaking massive. I don't know if I can say freaking at church. It's massive. And you were just sitting in one of the offices.
I was sitting in a cubicle, which is literally... that was the end.
Yeah.
I was like, this is what people do when they've given up. They go to a cubicle, and I was in one every day.
Yeah. And so a lot of people here probably know you somewhat. You've spoken here before. You're part of the church, well loved, well respected. And nobody would assume that you are defeated and depressed.
Yeah.
So talk about what happened,
Yeah.
what shifted.
Sure. So I started this job and then started to freak out. What have I done? I've given, I used to love the Lord. I was doing now I'm just punching a clock, coming in, coming out, whatever. Yeah. And so I was really melting down. And Amanda, my wife, if you ever need advice, talk to her. She's great. But she was basically, what is your problem? And I was like, listen, I was supposed to be a writer, and then I was doing the Lord's work, and now I work at this place. What is going on? What do I do? And she was like, Sam, I'm condensing down a long, drawn-out conversation because I'm dense and have to be told a lot of things. Yeah. And she was like, you are surrounded every single day by people who need to be loved, who need to be seen, who need to be appreciated, who need to understand they aren't what they do. It's like, oh yeah, I needed to hear that for myself, first of all.
Yeah.
And then I need to be able to bring that to the people around me. And that was almost overnight, just a switch in how I viewed everything about who I was and my work.
Yeah.
And it kind of unlocked in me the permission to totally be myself in the workplace, which I wasn't, which then inevitably helps other people do the same.
Yeah.
And that was a game changer for me.
Yeah. So you kept showing up and doing the job,
Yeah.
and very successfully you moved up in the company. But like, what are I mean, how did you do a good job at your job? And then also, like, give me some bullet points of like, what are the ways you were able to tap into those passions, that calling, find your voice in the midst of this?
Yeah, like one of my favorite things to do is to teach and coach and that kind of stuff. And I became a manager. So I led a small team, and it was one of those things where it was like, okay, I'm now going to like fully give myself at this place to these people. And that was like, it was a whole bizarre experience because I realized like, oh, that's not common. I was like,
What?
Right. And so it was like, people were like shocked by it.
Yeah.
And I think it actually like helped me progress in my career. 'Cause it was just, I'm just like actually caring about these people. But I would like, I would have like really direct conversations with people about who they were and how their work mattered, but how they also weren't their work. And I started coaching people. I discovered the Enneagram and then forced people to learn it with me because they reported to me and they had to. I like hijacked team meetings to like, we're gonna learn about one another, and we're gonna be more empathetic towards one another because we're gonna understand ourselves and how we are wired and how, I couldn't say how God's created us, but it's like how we were, designed. Or so I was like of doing that and like really investing in people in like, again, it was like very jarring to people. Yeah. And then naturally started to open up conversations about people's identity. Like, so one of my favorite stories to tell is during talent review time every year. I would sit people down because I was about to like talk them through numbers that defined the decision I was going to make about them, right? Which is like that was like what am I doing here? But I would have this speech where I gave all of them like, you are not this job. This job matters. You get paid to do this job. So like, we're going to do it well. We're going to bring our full selves to it. And this isn't you. And so like, even just having that conversation in the context of a talent review, it just like did something to people. Yeah. And so it was like a realization that like, oh yeah, like this is important stuff. Yeah. Like this is the Lord's work, if you may say, in a friggin' bank.
Yeah. Figure out that calling, figure out what does it look like to pursue and use your voice in the midst of that. That's and you're still there.
I'm there.
And still doing incredible stuff.
Still
and
there doing
always finding
stuff.
New ways. You ended up writing a book.
Yeah.
On the side.
Yeah, I wrote a book during like lunch break.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would go to a conference room.
One lunch break?
Lots of lunch breaks over time. But I would sneak off to a conference room and write as fast as I could,
And I just love it. Can we thank Sam for sharing a bit of his story? Thanks, dude. I love that. And when we were coming up with what we were going to talk about in this series, I wanted to... It's so important that we hear these stories and kind of get a glimpse of what it could look like for us. And Sam basically said the exact words, how you view what you do matters. And the second thing is how you do what you do matters. It's how you see it, the part that it plays, but also practically speaking, how you actually do it. Sometimes we can begin to believe that if our work feels frustrating or fruitless or meaningless, we begin to act that way. We phone it in. We just kind of check out of the process. But we represent something much bigger. It's important for us to remember that. We actually have a calling of how we show up, of how we do things. One of my favorite jobs ever was at In-N-Out. I worked at In-N-Out for like 4 years. And In-N-Out has a lot of like very strict kind of policies for their staff, and one of them is that men had to be clean shaven, which was never a huge challenge for me. But there was one day where I showed up, and I think I hadn't shaven in like 3 weeks, so they saw a couple hairs somewhere. And my manager literally gave me a disposable razor and said, "You need to go to the bathroom and shave your face." And she was dead serious. And I was young, and I was like, really? She's like, you represent a company, and this is our standard. And there's this aspect for us, we don't represent a company, but we are image bearers of our Creator who does things well. He does things that are good and very good. And he stands back and he observes what he's done and what he's created. And there's pride in that space. And so for us, we need to recognize that what we do matters. How you do what you do matters. Colossians 3 says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. And there is this important piece for us that when it comes down to it, even if your job is terrible and your boss is crazy and everything is hard, how you do what you do matters. There's very specific instructions about the way that we show up. So in the first one, I said, zoom out, how you view what you do. But for this one, it's zoom in. Look at the specifics of how you are doing your job, the way you are showing up. It is crucial. And it's important that each of us recognize that our jobs don't define us, just like Sam articulated. Our careers don't give us our intrinsic value. Yes, society and culture and the workforce, there's all kinds of differences in the way we value different jobs, and we can argue till the cows come home about what we feel about that. But our careers are not the thing that define who we are. Our work can't tell us who we are. We were created to be someone. Whose you are is crucial. If we look to our work itself to fulfill us, we will always be disappointed. But each of us has a calling, and we're charged with living that out. So practically, I'm going to land it here. I want to give you guys a few things to wrestle with, a few questions to consider. If you have a job and you're not necessarily sure what your calling is, I want you to think of these questions. If you think you know what your calling is, but it's tied to your job specifically, I want to just push back a little bit, and I want to invite you to revisit what you think your calling might be. So there's 5 questions I want us to think through. We don't have time to go through these in detail, so you may want to take a picture or we'll post them online. But the first one, notice it says unearth. It's not like 5 steps to figuring it out. It's like this process of an archaeological dig. But what do you love? And kind of some other ways of asking that question are, what are the things that make you sad or happy or angry or energized? What are the things that you get excited about? What are you good at? And also, it's important to know what you're bad at. I will not be pursuing a career as a baseball coach at any level. So what are you good at? How can you help shape the world more like God intended? There was this question of what is it that I can do to help create the world around me, to bring flourishing to the city of Los Angeles, as a sign flipper realized he could do it in a different way that creates his beauty. In what areas have you felt traction in past relationships, jobs, or roles? Honestly, this question was probably the most important one for me as I wrestled through my calling. As I look back and all of the work that I've done and all the various jobs, what are the things that I've seen the most success in? And the second one was the last question here. What do those who know you best see in you and say about you? In my whole life as a pastor, my whole career as a pastor, the thing that I have always heard is that I am just very authentic, for better or worse. I am very much who I am, and people feel like they can be that way. I've heard that over and over again, and I've seen that play out on teams that I worked on. That was a huge piece for me. And so for you to start to wrestle through this week and try and figure out, what is my calling? What is the voice that God has uniquely created me to do? And if it has to do with your job title, I want you to go back and I want you to work through it a little bit more. Let's pray together.